The rain had already soaked through his shoes when she asked a question that would change everything. Armin Qureshi stood under the flickering streetlight, his shoulders hunched against the cold, his 5-year-old daughter asleep in his arms, her small fingers curled into his worn jacket. The night was quiet except for the steady rhythm of rain hitting the pavement, and the distant hum of traffic that never quite reached this forgotten part of the city. He had just finished another exhausting shift at the warehouse, his body aching, his mind heavy with unpaid bills and unanswered worries, when a soft, trembling voice broke through the darkness. She asked if he could walk her home. For a moment, he hesitated. Life had taught him to be cautious, to avoid trouble, to protect the fragile world he had built around his daughter, Meher. But there was something in her voice, fear, yes, but also a quiet dignity, that made it impossible for him to turn away. He adjusted Meher in his arms and nodded, not knowing that this simple act of kindness would unravel truths far beyond his imagination. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of doing the right thing even when life is hard, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Heartfelt Stories. Your support keeps stories like this alive. The woman walked beside him, her steps careful, her eyes scanning the empty street as if shadows held memories she couldn't escape. Her clothes were simple, though slightly damp, and her hair clung to her face from the rain. She did not look like someone extraordinary. She looked like someone tired, someone carrying invisible weight. Armin didn't ask questions at first. He had learned that silence often offered more comfort than curiosity. The city at night had its own language, one of survival and distance, where strangers crossed paths without needing explanations. But as they walked, he noticed small details. Her shoes were expensive, though worn from rain. Her posture, even in fear, carried a quiet grace. And her hands, though trembling, were not the hands of someone used to hardship. He wondered what had brought her here. Armin's life had never allowed for wonder. After his wife, Syra, passed away 3 years ago, everything had become a series of tasks, sacrifices, and survival. He worked long hours, took extra shifts whenever possible, and spent every remaining moment caring for Meher. There were nights when he went to bed hungry, so she wouldn't have to. There were days when exhaustion blurred his vision, but he kept going because stopping was not an option. The world had not been kind to him, but he refused to let it harden his heart. As they turned onto a quieter road lined with old trees, the woman finally spoke again. Her voice was steadier now, though still soft, as if she was afraid of breaking something fragile between them. She thanked him, not just with words, but with sincerity that lingered in the air. Armin nodded, shifting Meher gently so she wouldn't wake. He told her it wasn't safe to walk alone at this hour. It wasn't a lecture, just a simple truth. She smiled faintly, though there was sadness in it, as if she knew that safety was not something easily found. The walk felt longer than it was. The rain began to slow, and the city seemed to hold its breath. When they finally reached a large iron gate at the end of the street, Armin stopped. The house, beyond it, was nothing like the buildings around it. It stood tall and silent, its windows dark, its walls echoing wealth and solitude. For the first time, Armin felt out of place. The woman turned to him, her eyes meeting his with a depth that made him uneasy. She thanked him again, more firmly this time, as if she was trying to say something more, but couldn't find the words. Armin simply nodded and turned to leave. He had no reason to stay, no place in her world, whatever that world was. But as he took a few steps away, she called out to him again. This time, her voice carried something different, something urgent, almost desperate. He turned back. She asked his name. Armin hesitated, then told her. She repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory. Then she looked at Meher, still asleep in his arms, and something in her expression changed. It softened, warmed, and for a brief moment, the fear in her eyes disappeared. She asked about his daughter, and he told her just enough. He didn't share the full story. He didn't talk about the hospital nights, the endless prayers, the silence that followed Cyrus' passing. He simply said that Meher was his whole world. The woman nodded, her gaze lingering on the child. Then, after a pause, she did something unexpected. She asked if she could see them again. Armin was caught off guard. People didn't ask for more. They took what they needed and moved on. That was how the world worked. But there was something in her request that didn't feel selfish. It felt human. He didn't give a clear answer. He simply said that he passed through this street sometimes after work. It was not a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. And with that, he left. Days passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Armin worked, cared for Meher, and tried not to think about the strange encounter. But something about that night stayed with him. It wasn't just a woman. It was a feeling that something had shifted, however slightly, in a life that rarely allowed for change. Then, one evening, as he walked home with Meher holding his hand, he saw her again. She was standing near the same streetlight, this time without the rain, without the fear. She looked different in the daylight, stronger, composed. But when she saw him, her expression softened in the same way it had that night. She greeted him like an old friend. This time, she introduced herself as Zoya Rahman. The name meant nothing to Armin at the time. They began to talk, cautiously at first, then more openly. Zoya asked about his life, and Armin, against his usual instincts, found himself sharing more than he expected. Not everything, but enough to reveal the truth behind his quiet strength. He spoke of long hours, of raising Meher alone, of the small victories that kept him going. Zoya listened, not the way people usually listen, with polite nods and distant attention, but with genuine interest, as if his story mattered, as if he mattered. In return, she shared little about herself. She spoke in fragments, careful and controlled, as if her life was a puzzle she wasn't ready to reveal. But there were hints of responsibility, of expectations, of a world far removed from Armin's. Despite the differences, something began to grow between them. Not romance, not yet, but a connection built on something rare. Understanding without judgment. Days turned into weeks. Their meetings became more frequent, almost unspoken routines that both of them began to rely on. Meher grew fond of Zoya, her laughter filling spaces that had long been quiet. Armin watched this with a mix of gratitude and caution. He didn't want to depend on something that might disappear, because everything eventually did. One afternoon, everything changed. Armin arrived at the street, but Zoya wasn't there. Instead, there were cars, expensive cars, and people, men in suits, women with hurried expressions, security guards at every corner. Confusion settled in. He stood at a distance, unsure whether to leave or stay when he saw her. Zoya stepped out of the gate, dressed not in simple clothes, but in elegance that spoke of power and wealth. Her presence commanded attention. The people around her moved with purpose, responding to her words with respect, even urgency. Armin froze. In that moment, the truth revealed itself. Zoya Rahman was not just another woman walking alone at night. She was one of the wealthiest individuals in the city, a name known in business circles, whispered in admiration and envy, a millionaire who lived in a world Armin had only seen from a distance. And suddenly, everything made sense. The house, the shoes, the silence about her life. Armin felt a strange mix of emotions. Surprise, yes, but also something deeper. A realization that the connection they had built existed across a divide that neither of them had acknowledged. He turned to leave, feeling that he no longer belonged in that story. But before he could take more than a few steps, Zoya saw him. And everything stopped. Her expression changed, not into something distant or unfamiliar, but into something deeply personal. She walked toward him, ignoring the people calling after her, ignoring the world that seemed to demand her attention. When she reached him, there was no hesitation. She spoke his name the same way she had that first night, as if nothing had changed. And in that moment, Armin realized something that would stay with him forever. Kindness doesn't recognize status. It doesn't care about wealth or poverty. It simply exists. The world around them faded as they stood there. Two people from entirely different lives, connected by a single act of compassion that neither of them had expected.